Hey, everybody. If you're listening to this, you are listening to the first free hour of this episode of The Shift with Doug McKenty. If you like what you're hearing, please consider subscribing to the show in order to access the full feature-length versions of the podcast, as well as have access to the members forum, where we discuss potential topics and interviews and dive deep into the overall concept of The Shift. For only $6 a month, not only do you get the full-length episodes, but also an opportunity to co-create with me, your host, Doug McKenty, the future of the show. Go to www.theshiftnow.com or patreon.com/theshift and sign up today in order to help make the shift possible. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. I am your host. My name is Doug McKenty. This episode was recorded on October 8th, 2020. You can find out more about the show at The Shift with Doug McKenty on Facebook and YouTube, at DMcKenty on Twitter, or at www.theshiftnow.com on the web. My guest today is Dr. Thomas Cowan, functional medicine doctor and author of The Contagion myth, as well as Cancer and the New Biology of Water, Vaccines, Autoimmunity, and the Changing Nature of Childhood Illness, and Human Heart, Cosmic Heart. His medical studies include graduate work at the Michigan State University College of Human Medicine, with a residency and family practice at Johnson City Hospital in New York. Dr. Cowan started his career following the teachings of early 20th century philosopher and educator Rudolf Steiner, and practiced medicine for almost 4 decades in San Francisco, California, recently closing his practice to focus on the simpler life. While his work spans the gamut of common medical issues from child care to heart disease, his most recent book focuses on the controversial theory that viruses are not the principal cause of contagion. In The Contagion myth, Dr. Cowan, with co-author Sally Fallon Morell of the Weston A. Price Foundation, explores the remarkably weak case for a viral contagion theory as presented by most scientists today. They go into detail about other possible causes of disease, constructing a different narrative surrounding the facts presented in the current scientific literature. Dr. Cowan describes a system of health and disease that remarkably coincides with many healing traditions from around the world, yet his conclusions are discovered within the context of the Western scientific modality. Tune in to this conversation where Dr. Cowan will lay down the facts that shed doubt on the common myths surrounding the origin of disease and describes a more holistic approach to health and wellness. Find out more about Dr. Cowan's work and get a copy of the book at www.drtomcowan.com or visit westonaprice.org for more information. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast. We rely on listeners like you for peer-to-peer distribution of this important information. Thank you, Dr. Thomas Cowan, for agreeing to appear on this program, and thank you for helping to make the shift. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this 55th episode of The Shift. I'm here today with Dr. Thomas Cowan. Been wanting to have him on the show for quite a while now. He's got a new book out entitled The Contagion Myth, and I think you'll all be really excited to check this one out. It's got the terrain theory, a lot of the electromagnetic toxicity information in it. And so if you're interested in these topics, then by all means, this is the best probably source for information that's out there now, all packaged together in one book entitled The Contagion Myth. So thanks for putting this out, Dr. Cowan. And do you want to just start us off by giving a little bit of your background and history and why you wanted to write this book?
So I've been a practicing general practice medical doctor since 1985. And pretty much all that time I was working with a different model of health than the conventional medicine, trying to figure my way into what really works for people and why people get sick and how they get better, and just trying to do whatever I could to help people out without using drugs and surgery and that stuff as much as possible. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much my background. The other thing is I've always been drawn to scientific truths, which often turn out not to be actually true. So and a number of my books are based on those kind of things. So one of the books was I tried to demonstrate that it's not possible for the heart to push the blood around the body. In other words, the heart isn't a pump, and that blocked arteries are not the main cause of heart attacks, even though everybody thinks they are.
Yeah.
And then the next book, I looked at vaccines and basically came to the conclusion that they don't work and they're not safe. And then the third one had to do with cancer is not a genetic disease, and because we think it is, we haven't been able to treat it in spite of spending trillions of dollars. And the numbers are we have about 2.3% improvement in outcomes based on a few $1 trillion worth of research. So that's sort of the background. And then I've known about the problem with viral theory and even the whole issue with contagion for decades. But I didn't really want to get into it because it's such a deep core myth that we all live under. And even though I could see the point in tackling this, I just sort of didn't want to. But then I was asked to go to a conference, and it was right when the whole COVID thing started. And I went, and there were not many people there, and the other presenters didn't show up because they didn't want to travel. And I ended up giving a talk to about 20 people that was, I would say I didn't really know it was being taped. I sort of knew if I thought about it, but I really thought I was talking to 20 people.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically said that viruses don't cause disease, and there's a whole other reason why there's this COVID-19. And I explained that a little bit, not a whole lot, because it was only about 10 minutes. And the next thing I know, I've heard something like 100 million people saw that video.
Wow.
And I got calls from NBC and CBC and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and outlets in Europe, and hundreds of emails, probably more. And I decided that it's time that I really looked into this subject.
Yeah.
And I decided that I needed to become fluent in virology because the problem is that if you talk about most Americans, and now I'm talking about 99%, mm-hmm. they are not fluent in virology. They are virologically illiterate.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is, having been a doctor for 38 years and actually writing a book about vaccines, I can say also that I would say 98% of medical doctors are also virologically illiterate. And I say that as a kind of criticism, but a year ago, I would have put myself in the same category, looking back. Mm-hmm. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have not said I was illiterate, but that's because I didn't know better. and that's unfortunate, but that's the way life is. You learn.
Live and learn,
and so I basically took it upon myself to learn how to be literate in virology. And what I saw was that A, there's no coronavirus, and B, viruses don't cause disease. And I thought, given what I'm seeing, that I should probably tell somebody about that.
Right. Well, I've said this a couple of times because, of course, I mean, with coronavirus happening, I've done a multitude of interviews on this subject now. And I think that it's almost fascinating that this whole thing has actually kind of opened up this Pandora's box conversation about viral theory, and that now a number of people like yourself, like the terrain theorists, have come out and said, hey, wait a minute, does this even exist? And so, a lot of us are taking a step back and going, man, I never even thought about this before. This is something that's given to us from the time, we're in school, from the time we're young kids, that viruses are contagious and this is how disease spreads. And it's just a given. And so actually to take this opportunity to take a step back and say, wait a minute, has this stuff actually been proven? And then to see it written out in your book so succinctly, actually, when we go back into the history of science, you find out that, this has been a question for a long time. One of the things that you pose in the book, which I found really interesting, is that Western medicine is even the only system of medicine that's ever posited a contagion theory, that no other culture in the history of humanity has ever, put this forth as a possibility. And so to go back through the science and to find out, where the germ theory was never actually proven, and then to go step by step kind of through this process and say, well, if this hasn't been proven, then what's really going on? So will you go through some of that history that you write about, like the difference between Pasteur and Beauchamp's back in the 19th century, and then, Koch's postulates and how they haven't really ever been fulfilled, and that kind of thing? Because it's surprising to see and to learn that even according to the Western sciences criteria, this germ theory was never actually proven.
Right. And I also have a little bit different take on it than what most people call terrain theory.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Sure.
close, but I have come to a little bit different understanding. That, of course, doesn't mean I'm right, but that's the way I think. So here's the way I would describe this. First of all, the idea that there is contagion, and it's always good to define one's terms. That means somebody gets sick or an animal gets sick, and then they pass something to another human being or another animal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that could be something that you can't see because obviously it's smaller than you can see. And that idea has been around for thousands of years because there's a certain observation and it just seems correct. I got sick and then my wife got sick, or my child got sick, or in school, and then a bunch of other children. So the idea that there is something being passed between people or animals seems to make sense. But as you pointed out, the interesting thing is when you go back and look at Native American medicine and Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and homeopathy, none of them had an idea of contagion. The other thing I would say is that when you ask most people, how do you know there's a virus causing the disease? Could be coronavirus or chickenpox or anything. They say things like, because I had it and then my friend had it, or because a lot of people get sick in one place, or because there was a nursing home and somebody went there who had a positive corona test and then everybody got sick, or because a bunch of people spread it on a cruise ship. And the first thing to say about that is those are epidemiological observations. In other words, those are what epidemiologists use to generate hypotheses. You can never prove causation with epidemiology. And now I'm telling people, I don't need 10 more stories about how your Aunt Bessie went to a party and then she got sick.
Right.
Because I agree that there's enough epidemiology to investigate a microbial cause of disease. Fine, that's the purpose of epidemiology, so let's do it. Now, at that point, most people, if you say, okay, we should investigate whether these epidemiological observations, right, this person got sick and then that person, are caused by a virus, do you know how a doctor or a medical scientist would prove that? And they have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting because if you have no idea how you would even go about proving it, it's just curious that you're so sure that it's true. Not you, but somebody.
Right. Lots of people, most people, for sure.
Most people, but they have no idea how you would even go about doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So here's how this came about. So basically, they had this idea that diseases were contagious. But let me also point out that you can be misled by that. So, for instance, for hundreds of years, people saw sailors on ships getting sick one after another. And they said, this must be contagious. And then somebody ate a lime and the whole thing went away because it was scurvy.
Mm-hmm.
And millions of people died from scurvy with the idea that it was contagious. The same thing happened with pellagra and beriberi. And the idea that if a lot of people die in one place, that means it's a virus, which some people say, is ridiculous because they blew off a bomb in Hiroshima and a lot of people died, and that was not a virus. And then it spread all over Eastern Europe after Chernobyl, and then a lot of people got sick. And so the idea that something spreads is also not proof that it's a virus. So, and the same with bacteria, or we could say it doesn't prove it's a microbe. So here we were in the 1800s, and they had this theory, and then what happened was what I call the first eureka moment, right? So here's all these people thinking there's something spread from one person to another. We can't see it, but it must be small. And then they invent a microscope, and they see a bacteria. And it's like, aha, we finally see it.
Right.
And then, you know, you could take a case like anthrax, which is a bacterial disease, so-called, and they say there's all these sheep who are dying, and you look in their blood and tissues, and they all have this anthrax bacteria, except not actually all of them, but let's say most of them.
Right.
And so that makes you think, right, it's the bacteria, you know, the bacteria cause the disease. Same with people have sore throat. You look in their throat, and they have strep. And you say that strep must have caused this sore throat. Now, again, nobody really thinks that's proof because you could go to a fire and you could see firemen and they are at the fire. And as far as I know, nobody thinks, at least most firemen don't cause fires.
Right.
So you can't say that. And so then they said, okay, so we see these bacteria at the site of this disease. And then we looked at healthy sheep, right? They don't have anything wrong with them. And they said we shouldn't find the bacteria, right? Because they're not sick. Turns out about 50% of the sheep who weren't sick did have the anthrax bacteria.
Right.
And that confused them because that shouldn't be, but anyways, who knows? So then they did the next logical thing, and Pasteur did this and a bunch of other people. They took the bacteria and they isolated it, right? Because if you're going to prove that a hammer causes, if you bang somebody with a hammer, it breaks their thumb. You have to, if you want to prove that that's the cause, you can't drop a cinder block brick on their thumb with a hammer embedded in it and then say it was the hammer.
Right.
You have to take the hammer out and see if that's the thing that breaks their thumb. You can't drop a brick and another brick and then a bunch of rocks because then you don't know what happens. So they did the logical thing, which was to take the bacteria out, expose some animals to it, and none of them got sick. And then they did that over and over again with different bacteria, and much to their surprise, none of them got sick. So they came to the inevitable conclusion that the logic, which is people who are sick have the bacteria, or animals. Animals who are sick, who are not sick, don't. And then if you take the bacteria from sick animals or people and you give it to healthy animals or people, they should get sick. That's
Right.
just logic.
Yeah.
And it turns out it didn't happen like that. And anyways, they said at that point, in some interesting quirk of history, the logic must be wrong.
Right.
You could also say bacteria don't cause illness. And one of the ways that I tell people you might think about that is, you know, if you have a compost pile and you put stuff that doesn't belong, you get bacteria growing in there to eat the dead stuff. And nobody says it's an infection. That's bioremediation.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you have a forest and you cut down a tree and you said, oh, I don't want the tree to have an infection or the forest, so you get rid of all the fungus and bacteria in the forest with antifungals and antibiotics, then the forest dies because all the dead trees just build up and clog up the forest. So The point is, the role of bacteria in nature is to feed off, dead and diseased tissue as a way of helping you recycle it back into life. Now, and so that is the sort of another way to look at this problem. It's not that they're causing disease. So then we go from there, and then they had a bunch of diseases, particularly at that time, polio. So a bunch of children and people were getting sick, one after another, must be contagious. They look in their brain and their spine where the disease is, and there's no bacteria. So they said, there must be something smaller than a bacteria that we can't see, and that's what's the contagious thing. And they called it a virus for the Latin word meaning poison. But they couldn't see it at that time. So again, they tried to see if they could spread disease. So they took, for instance, a diseased brains from somebody who died, and they ground it up, and they ground it up, centrifuged it, got rid of the cell part and the bacteria. And so they gave them just the liquid called the supernatant. And they gave this to 20 or so different animals. They drank it, they injected it, and none of them got sick. And that's where the virus was supposed to be. And none of them got sick. So then they came to an interesting conclusion. They said, that's because there's no animal models of polio, which is interesting because, again, there's no animal models. You can't do it on people because that's unethical. So you literally have no evidence that this unpurified stuff from somebody's dead brain actually causes disease. And you just say it's because there's no animal model. So then finally they were able to prove that polio was caused by a transmissible thing. So here's how it went. They took a diseased spine of a child with paralysis. They ground it up in a blender. They centrifuged it, took the liquid part where the virus supposedly lived, took 2 monkeys, drilled a hole in their brain, injected about a half a cup of this unpurified stuff in their brain, didn't do a control, so they didn't inject, a half a cup of saline or a half a cup of normal spine. And 1 monkey died, and the other got paralyzed, and they held the monkey up by the scruff of the neck and said, see, we proved polio is caused by a virus.
Right.
And, when I read that for the first time, I thought to myself, I don't even want to say what I thought, like, what?
Yeah.
Because that's just nonsense. First of all, you don't know whether the monkey died because they herniated its brainstem. Like, if you inject a half a cup of goop in somebody's brain, it pushes their brainstem down and they may die.
Right. Likely to cause some symptoms.
Right. That's not a good thing for a person to have happen to them.
Yeah.
So anyway, they did that with a bunch of other viruses, and then they couldn't transmit disease except by these kind of extraordinary and very unscientific way. And then came what I call the next eureka moment. So here they are thinking, we know there's something small that we can't see. It doesn't seem to transmit to animals, but we know it does anyways. I don't know how they thought they knew, but they said they did.
Right.
And then they invent an electron microscope. And again, like the bacteria, they could look at a diseased spine and they see all these particles. And eureka, that's the virus, that's what's causing the disease. So then they spent 20 years, purifying the virus, which you can do, isolating it, giving it, to animals and, people and stuff, different kinds of viruses, and none of them got sick. None of them. So they actually could isolate and purify a virus, but it didn't make anybody sick. And then, as a friend of mine said, the virologists had proved that there's nothing to virology, and they were going to become plumbers.
Yeah.
Except they got rescued by somebody who came up with a method of proving that viruses cause disease. And that saved virology. And that guy was named Embers, and he got a Nobel Prize. And here's what Embers did. He took a child with measles, did the same thing, unpurified lung fluid, ground it up in a blender, centrifuged it, took the liquid part, and then put it on tissue culture from monkey kidneys, right? And nothing happened. It didn't kill the tissue culture.
Right.
And then came the turning point in virology. He said, I know how to prove that this virus in this liquid can destroy the tissue because I can starve the tissue and poison it with gentamicin and then amphotericin, which are kidney toxins, and then the kidney tissue falls apart, and that proves the virus kills your kidney.
Right.
And again, when you read that, you think, what the hell?
Right.
How do you know it's not because you starved and poisoned the tissue? And the answer is he didn't. But to this day, that's how we prove viruses cause disease.
Right.
We take unpurified stuff, we inoculate it onto a tissue, like a Vero tissue, which is monkey kidney tissue. Nothing happens, so they starve and poison it. They don't have to tell you what poisons they use. And then it breaks down into all these particles, and they say, see, that means it killed the tissue, which causes disease. That's what they did for the coronavirus. Now, the interesting question is, so why does tissue break down into these particles that look like viruses? And nobody knew the answer to that, but now we do, which is that when you poison a tissue, whether it's in you or even in a tissue culture, the tissue says, hey, we've been poisoned. It packages up its DNA or RNA into these little packages called exosomes or viruses.
Right.
And it uses that as a detoxification mechanism. And it even through a kind of resonance phenomena can communicate to other beings that, hey, we've been poisoned with DDT. You should make a defensive reaction. So these so-called viruses or exosomes are messengers, and they're actually the agent of evolution. That's the interesting thing. They are the rapid response team, because this whole theory of mutations and then natural selection is way too slow to adapt to anything in real time. You'd have to wait 10,000 years for a mutation in one person to spread through the population.
Yeah.
And in 10,000 years, you got a new poison. So that's how it works.
Yeah, I just had this fascinating conversation with Dr. Stephanie Seneff about this, and it's just mind-boggling to come to the conclusion that, we've all been taught to be scared of viruses or scared of exosomes, whatever they are. But what's starting to come out of the work that people like yourself are doing is this notion that the viruses actually contain genetic coding to help us detox.
Yeah.
And then this can get past, this may be contagious. I guess now might be a good time to segue into this idea of resonance. I think Dr. Seneff and Dr. Judy Mikovits, at least from my conversations with them, have been saying that there's a viral particle that still is spread, perhaps through aerosols. I haven't really gotten into it in the detail with them, but you have this concept of resonance, which I find fascinating, and it's an alternative theory to having anything going external, except for perhaps some kind of radio signal or these electromagnetic waves. Yeah.
First of all, I must say I disagree with the idea that there's any viral particle that has been isolated and seen and spreading between people.
Mm-hmm.
And
do they find these particles? They talk about seeing them on surfaces and such. I mean, do they find them on the surfaces? Have you analyzed that data?
I've analyzed that in great detail.
Uh-huh.
And let me tell you, here's what the CDC says. And a paper dated July 13th, 2020. So this was just a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
This is page 39 in a document that they wrote called CDC 2019 Novel Coronavirus Real-Time RT-PCR Diagnostic Panel. Quote, no quantified virus isolates of the 2019 COVID virus are currently available. In other words, they have never seen this virus. And every paper that has been, some of them are called the isolation and purification of the novel coronavirus, right? That's the title of the paper. When you look at the paper, they did not isolate or purify the coronavirus. They never once did that. And I would say to people who say, how do you know that? I know that for two reasons. One, because we asked them, did you purify the virus?
Right.
And they said no.
Yeah.
They said we did not attempt to purify the virus. Now, the other reason I know that is because if you isolate and purify a virus, you're required by scientific protocol to publish the picture of the isolated virus. And, you know, I have some pictures here. I don't know if you can see it. Here's a picture of a herpes virus that has been isolated and purified. Now, here's the picture of a paper that says they isolated and purified the coronavirus, and it's just a bunch of goop
right.
with an arrow to one little dot saying that is the coronavirus. Now, there's a big difference between these two. Right? This is isolated and purified so you can characterize it. This is just a bunch of stuff. And so then if you go and say, I know that a genetic piece is from this, you don't know where the genetic piece is from. You don't know whether it's from this dot or any other dots or from the cell debris or anything. And so you can't, if you can't isolate it, you can't prove it causes disease. You can't analyze the genetic material. You can't make a test. You have no idea whether it actually exists in reality or is just a cellular detoxification mechanism, which is actually what it is.
So in the book, you go through a number of these studies claiming to have isolated the coronavirus, and they seem to skip over the filtration step. Do you want to talk about this for my audience? Like they're doing centrifuge, they're running it through the centrifuge, and so they're getting something, but then they don't filter it, which seems an obvious step, right?
Here's how you isolate a virus. And again, this was done in the 30s until the 50s, when they basically changed the definition of isolation. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's interesting is the guy who knows the most about this probably in the world, his name is Stefan Lanka. And he was credited with discovering the first virus in the ocean. And here's how he did it. And here's how the virologist did it. And by the way, this is the exact steps that are outlined in a 1973 Pasteur Institute virology conference, and they came to it what they call the consensus agreement to how to isolate and purify a virus. So I'm not making this up. This was accepted practice. It's doable, and the virologist in 1973 agreed this is the way to do it. Mm-hmm. Here's how you do it. You take some tissue, like lung fluid, or in Stefan Lanka's case, sea algae, right? And you grind it up in a blender. That just loosens it up so you can work with it better. It's similar to how you make coffee. You take coffee beans and then you grind them up in a coffee grinder. And then you have liquid stuff, and then you filter it through a filter paper that only lets the liquid and the viruses and the proteins through and keeps the cells and the other debris and the bacteria from going through.
Mm-hmm.
It's, again, very similar to how you make coffee, right? You put it through a filter, the coffee part goes through, and all the grinds and stuff, they stay above. Now, what you have then is unpurified liquid with viruses and proteins and a bunch of other things in it. So then you do something called density centrifugation, which is you make a sucrose gel and you spin it real fast and things separate by weight. So just to say a number, everything that's 1 pound makes a band here,
Mm-hmm.
everything 2 pounds and 1.5 makes a band in the middle. And those are purified particles of the same weight. So if you have a virus that's 1.5 pounds, it'll make a band. You have another virus, 2 pounds, that'll make a different band. And then you take a syringe or a pipette and you suck that band out, right? And then you look at it under electron microscope and you see whether you did it properly, because maybe you didn't spin it long enough, so it didn't purify enough.
Right. I mean, and
then
even
you publish it and you get this.
right. Because even
And
if
then,
you go,
because nobody believes you, we're not supposed to believe other people. They may have made it up. So you have to show us the picture.
yeah.
And that's how you do it. It's very simple, straightforward. And that's how virologists isolate and purify. And I can tell you, there is no example of an isolated, purified Hep C virus, HIV virus, coronavirus, measles virus.
Right.
They don't exist.
I mean, even if you go through this process, you're going to get stuff. If it's the same size and the same weight, you're going to look at it under the microscope. You're going to see a few different things there. And it's not just going to be all one type of
No, it's
particle.
all one thing.
Right.
It is all one thing. It's like if you want to separate elephants from rhinoceros, they, I think, weigh different.
Yeah, if they
one would come out in an elephant band and the other in a rhinoceros band.
Sure.
And they wouldn't mix because they weigh different. And this is a very potent technique of separating things out by weight. And it's a very, intuitive and logical way of separating things. And it's been done for 20 years with hundreds of different viruses or exosomes. That's how they purify exosomes. And then they see if it helps you grow your hair back. So this is not an unusual step. Now, it's what's interesting is if you ask a virologist, so why don't you take lung fluid from somebody with COVID, grind it up, filter it, centrifuge it, show us the picture. You know what they say? There's not enough to see.
Yeah.
And then you say, wait a minute, if there's not enough to see, why do you think that's going to kill the person? Well, because it's the cause. How do you know? You can't, if you do that, you don't see anything. The only way you see it is if you take that unpurified mess and inoculate it on a tissue, starve and poison the tissue, and it breaks down into this stuff, which is the way the tissue detoxifies, and then you can see it. And that's nuts, because that's not even coming from this original person. That's coming from the tissue. Now, it's true that the original person who's sick probably has some kind of poison or something degrading in him, which will influence what happens with the tissue. That's what throws them off. Because if you put the stuff from a measles person in versus a chickenpox, you get different breakdown products. But that's simply because whatever caused it was different. And it's still there. And again, you could say, how do I know this? One of the reasons I know it is Stefan Lankus said, look, this is how you said there's a measles virus, and I can prove to you there is no measles virus because I do the same whole procedure, except I start with somebody who doesn't have measles, and it still breaks down the tissue. And I'll give anybody 100,000 euros if they show me an isolated, purified measles virus. And
Right.
eventually people took him up on it. And it went to the German Supreme Court, and they said there's no evidence the measles virus exists.
And this is the same guy that isolated the viruses in
Yeah.
the algae. Hmm.
And, it's interesting when what got him going on this is he says, okay, I found the virus in the sea algae. And then he noticed that the sea algae that had the virus were healthy, and the
Right.
sea algae that didn't have the virus were sick. And he said, that's weird, because I thought viruses are supposed to be bad for us. And then he started looking into the literature, and to his surprise, found that when tissues make these viruses, they're healthier because they can detoxify. And if you stop a tissue from making these viruses, otherwise known as exosomes, they get sick and die. And he said to himself, wait a minute, this is wrong. These things don't cause disease. There is no published record of isolated, purified virus causing animal or human disease. And that's really where we're at.
Well, I mean, this, I was reading in the book, and so this guy Stephen Lanka basically then posited the notion that now everybody knows is true, that human beings have a virome. We have trillions of these viruses or exosomes. So, you don't think there's a difference at all between an exosome and a virus? Is that true, or are these two
There is
different?
no difference.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the virologists say.
They're seeing exosomes and they're trying to call them viruses and saying they're contagious, but it's actually just this detoxification system that we have in our
Yes.
body that's composed of these exosomes.
It's
And
a detoxification communication system,
Mhm.
period. There's
Yeah.
nothing pathogenic about this.
Well, that's
And
just
anybody who, when you go back, so I spent the last 9 months looking for a study that shows me that a isolated virus, right, causes human disease. Now, what's interesting is, so I go to AIDS, right, caused by HIV, we're
Mhm.
told. So where is the paper that says HIV causes AIDS? Eventually, I found it. It goes like this. There was, so they do antibody tests on people, and they say, because you have antibodies, that means you have a virus that's going to kill you, which is interesting because if you do an antibody test for somebody with mumps, they say you're immune for life against the virus.
right.
But if you have antibodies to HIV, that means the virus is going to kill you. How they explain that, I don't know. But anyways, they
Yeah, that's
took a
crazy. It's
person
crazy that what people think is true, like this antibody thing, everybody thinks this is true. And then it's like, but then even when they were coming out a month ago and saying, well, when you have antibodies for coronavirus, it might not help you. It's like, well, what? What happened to
right.
your old theory, and where are these theories coming from? And like, you guys, like, you look it up and there is no foundation for this. It seems to be common knowledge. Everybody thinks it's what science has proven, but it's just not. It's just something somebody said. Like, it's crazy to me.
It is. It's totally
Yeah.
crazy. But anyways,
Go
here's
ahead.
the story. So there's somebody with AIDS who's HIV positive. Now, if you look in the package insert for the HIV positive antibody test, it says there's 33 other conditions that can cause you to be HIV positive: stress, pregnancy, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, 29 other ones.
Wow.
So you have no idea what the matter with this person is.
Right.
So they take blood from this sick person, right? They don't isolate anything, they don't purify it. They inject it into one chimpanzee. Then they put the chimpanzee in a cage for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, the chimpanzee gets what they call an opportunistic infection, which might be a yeast infection because that's an opportunistic infection. So they didn't actually say, and is HIV positive. So in other words, the proof that HIV causes AIDS is you took blood from somebody who's sick, injected that in a chimpanzee, put the chimpanzee in solitary confinement for 10 years, fed him God knows what. The
Right.
chimpanzee got a yeast infection, and that means HIV causes AIDS. I don't know about you, but that seems like messed up.
Yeah.
That's not proof of anything except chimpanzees don't like to be put in cages for 10 years, and they might get sick if you do that.
Will you tell my listeners, since we're kind of on the subject, about the 1919, the study that was done in 1919 to try to prove that the flu, the 1919 flu, was contagious? They're literally like injecting people's blood. So they actually found human volunteers, and they're doing this on humans, and they
Right.
couldn't get them sick. It's crazy
So
when I
here's
read that.
another interesting. So by everybody's estimation, the most virulent, most contagious virus in recent history, right? So we know about it.
Yeah.
It was the 1918 so-called Spanish flu pandemic. Highly contagious, killed 20 to 50 million people. So in one of the best medical studies ever done, in my opinion, the Boston Health Department, 1919, in the middle of the flu, got 100 people who were in various stages of having the Spanish flu. They were high fever, sick, some of them died, they were coughing, the whole bit. Florid, absolutely incontrovertible flu. And then they get 100 prisoners. And I think they bribed them, and they said, if you volunteer, we'll let you out.
Right.
So they did. Now, they divided them into three groups. One, they took the sick person and they coughed right in their face of the healthy volunteer, so-called volunteer, for 20 minutes. The next group, also about 30 people, and they recorded each person what happened to them. They put their open mouth like you were like kissing, right? So that close together, but they didn't touch. And then the sick person forcefully breathed into the open mouth of the volunteer for between 15 and 20 minutes.
Right. That'll pass in aerosols.
Right. In the third group, they took the sick people and they sucked the snot out of their nose and injected the snot into the nose of the healthy person, the volunteer.
Right.
And then they saw what happened. And they report, in the studies in our book, one of the 100 volunteers got sick, and he was one of the ones they stuck the stuff up his nose. And what he got was a runny nose.
Yeah.
Which I thought, right. And it had no relation to the flu. I mean, he wasn't sick. He just like got a runny nose.
Right.
And what's so interesting about this is they then had a so-called discussion where they were commenting on their findings, right? So they clearly say not one person got sick. And here's two possible conclusions. One, apparently this isn't contagious.
Yeah.
Number two, we should have tried harder to make the volunteers sick.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, because that's what they said.
Yeah.
We didn't try hard enough. And I thought, what do they think they have to do? Like a lung transplant? I mean,
right.
It's true. If you do that, somebody might get sick.
Yeah.
But it's not because of a virus. It's because it's not good to get a lung transplant.
Right. Or we could inject it straight into their brains and see if we get a reaction that way. You know?
Yeah, right. I mean, this is the point is the delusion is so thick, right?
Yeah.
This is like a spell.
Yeah, right.
And even faced with the most, I mean, it was a very good study, right? They did exactly what you should have done. They tried any reasonable way to identify sick people in the throes of their infection, right? They weren't over it. They knew also, some people have criticized me and say, how do you know those 100 people hadn't had the flu before and now they were immune?
Right.
The answer is because they asked them, have you guys ever been sick? And they said no. They had no evidence that they were sick at all. And so maybe they said they were, so-called asymptomatic You can
Yeah,
make up
right.
all kinds of names, but the fact of the matter is, they said they were never sick. And the idea that they happened to pick 100 people who had the flu and now were immune is frankly ludicrous.
Right.
I mean, that's just nonsense.
Well, it should be noted, I think, because these vaccines and the whole theory of vaccines that started 200 plus years ago, I mean, this is a way where doctors can make money off people who are healthy. I mean, this is, something that I've thought about in the past, and just to provide a motive. Like, why are so many people pushing this viral theory? And it's because it's highly profitable and it gives you a reason to do a procedure on someone who's healthy. You're not waiting for somebody to get sick. So suddenly, instead of just sick people being your financial base, then everybody needs to get a vaccine. Healthy people need to get this procedure done, and so there's such a profit motive to prove that germ theory is true and that vaccines work, that I think it's just over the course of these 200 years. I mean, it's just one of the reasons why I think these studies happen over and over again, and they want to insist that it's still true, even though they can't prove it doing any of their experiments. I mean, does this make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's always, I try to avoid ascribing motives to people I don't know, right? Because
Sure.
that gets you into trouble. But I mean, there certainly is that. And I actually think there's a bigger problem than even just the financial motive.
Hmm.
It's a way of looking at the world that fundamentally says, the world is somehow out to get me, and I have to, protect myself against other people and other animals and communicating with other people. And that's a very toxic way to think about life.
Sure.
And I think that's more noxious than even the financial part, because that creates a society that nobody wants to live in. And that's unfortunately what's happening.
Right. I mean, you talk about fear in the book, just the stress of being under fear and what's going on right now with the coronavirus thing. Everybody's scared out of their minds because they think this invisible invading army of viruses is out to get them.
Right. And, it's interesting because, as I think, pointed out, it turns out that fear itself has been proven to make your tissues create exosomes.
Hmm.
And so you can actually make people make something that, quote, looks like this virus and gives you the genetic material that, if that's your thing, is to try to find pieces of genetic material, you because what a PCR test is measuring fundamentally is how much tissue breakdown you have. That's why it looks like sick people have a higher, quote, viral load, because they're actually breaking down the most.
Hmm. Right.
They have the most toxic exposure, whether it's fear or electromagnetic fields or arsenic or whatever it is, or glyphosate. They're breaking down, and then you say, "Oh, you got a lot of viruses." They don't have a lot of viruses. They have a lot of destruction, and that's why they seem, they have all this stuff, these viral particles. I mean, the whole thing starts to make sense if you can think about it differently. You were talking about antibodies. There was a quote from, um, the head of some infectious disease part, and with a straight face when he was asked, "What do antibodies to coronavirus mean?" And he said, "Well, they either mean you were sick or you weren't sick. You're either immune or you're not immune.
Right.
And you either had the virus or you didn't have the virus." And I thought to myself, it's like going in buying a refrigerator. You go to the store and you say to the guy, "What do you think about this refrigerator?" He says, "Well, it's a good refrigerator. It'll either keep your food cold or it won't."
Right.
And if he said that, you would say, "You're a lunatic. You have no business being in this store." And yet somehow these are become respected scientists who say this same kind of nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's strange. And then, I mean, I've done an episode in the past, we can get into it, but just about this idea of scientism, like you're talking about, like this mythology of science that hasn't actually even been proven by science, including this kind of martial metaphor that you talk about, this invading army of invisible viruses that is going to, kill us all. Um, and it's not really proven by science, but everybody thinks that it's true. And everybody thinks it's been proven unequivocally by science. And so we all believe it. And we're the most rational people. I talk to people,
Yeah,
I try to bring up your ideas with my friends. They can barely even listen to what I'm trying to say. And I'm like, well, look at all these, scientific studies that have been done, and they won't read them, because their
yeah.
belief system is so ingrained. It's actually it's a fascinating. I did an interview last week about cognitive dissonance, trying to be like, why won't people look at this stuff? It's
Yeah.
rational even if they disagree. It's like,
I mean, that gets into the whole thing when people ask me, what do I think about, Amazon, essentially censoring my book. And,
yeah,
what I mainly think is, so I write this book, and, people listening can think whether they think I'm a lunatic or not. But I think I have some clear, well reasoned, well referenced, you know, things to say.
sure,
Now, is everything correct? I'm sure not. In fact, I know some things that I probably even a few months ago didn't know, and I would change.
yeah,
And I'm happy to have somebody say, "No, here's how we proved that coronavirus exists. Here's isolated, purified characterization of the genome. You missed this study. Fine, I'll actually correct it."
mm,
But instead, you never get that. In fact, I know that they, took it down without actually reading it, because I happen to know they never actually received the book.
oh
They
wow,
did it based on the title.
yeah,
And so why don't they say, here's his ideas, here's where he's incorrect based on this fact and this study, and here's this isolated thing? Fine. That's apparent. That's supposedly how the world is supposed to work. Instead, you're not allowed to say this. I mean,
hmm,
why not?
yeah, it's nuts. I want to bring up another point too, that this germ theory that you're talking about, like, I mean, we've discussed that it was basically, Pasteur is what, about 1860, 1870, and then we've got the discovery of the viruses in the 1930s. And then it wasn't until the 1980s when Western medicine had an understanding of how, like you're discussing, Stephen Lanka discovers this virome, that we actually have viruses in our body all the time. And then now people are talking about the virome. Like these are just, we have, I mean, literally trillions of these organisms in our body at all times. And now that we know of the existence, like now that science has discovered this, you'd think that their theories would change, right, to incorporate the new knowledge.
Yeah.
But instead, we see this clinging to this germ theory and this vaccination protocol, decades after people understand how, our bodies need bacteria and viruses or exosomes for this bioremediation. And then even,
And
I mean,
communication and detoxification.
yeah, right. I mean, why don't you go into that a little bit? Just then, the theory that disease is toxin based and not, viral based or contagion based.
I
Because
mean,
you go into that in the book a
it's
lot.
also, you're correct when the people in Pasteur's time insisted that there are no microorganisms in us, from like our skin inward,
Hmm.
except those that cause disease, right? So that's what the people who came up with the germ theory thought. Now, nobody thinks that today. But,
Right.
I'm not that old, but I remember in my early days in medicine, we used to still think that, and we would take people who were sick and we would attempt to sterilize them, give them antibiotics until all their bacteria were gone so we could
Right.
cure them. And I can tell you, it never once worked.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
the
and this is,
reality is, bacteria are there to biodegrade toxins. So, how does it work? You get exposed to a toxin, it deteriorates your tissue. The bacteria that are always there, they they see a situation, they actually change their form to be specific to bioremediate that dead and diseased tissue.
Mm-hmm.
That's the role of bacteria. Viruses, they typically happen when there's been damage to the genetic material, either the DNA or the RNA, through a variety of toxins, in particular electromagnetic field toxins, which are specifically toxic to the DNA because DNA are actually antennae. So they deteriorate the DNA. The body packages them up as these so-called viruses to A, get rid of the poison, and B, communicate what's happened. That is the role of viruses and bacteria in nature.
Mm-hmm.
There's no room for them being pathogenic.
Yeah, I mean, it's again going back to that Martial mythology, that theory that these invading microorganisms are like dirty, and the solution is to sterilize them. And you see it in all of Western medicine to this day, where you make me think about chemotherapy, which you bring up in the book about cancer. Where they're looking at cancer, and they're just trying to kill the cancer. It's like this eradication and sterilization of the problem instead of this alternative mythology, which all other cultures in the history of the world have worked with, which is trying to find a balance between the energies that are at play. And then when you're imbalanced, then you're healthy. It's not the invading enemy that has to be eradicated, right?
Right. So you can see cancer very simply. You have this tissue, which is basically organized water,
mm-hmm.
right? So you have a breast. It's organized water. It's organized by the proteins in it and the water in it and the fats and the minerals. And then you start poisoning it, and it says, wow, I got to put this poison into a garbage can to keep it out of the general tissue. So it creates these so-called cancerous cells. It puts the toxins in the garbage can, and then you're sort of okay. Except if you keep filling more and more garbage cans, then eventually your whole house is full of garbage cans, and we call that metastatic cancer.
Yeah.
And that's the whole problem right there. You poison a tissue, it collects the poison as it should. Just like if I came to your house and dumped a whole lot of garbage in it, and I said, it's better for you not to put it in garbage cans, you just leave it in your house, you would say, that's ridiculous. I'm going to buy some garbage bags, put the garbage in there, and hopefully take it out to the curb so somebody can get rid of it.
Right.
And unfortunately, because we don't understand this, we get rid of the garbage cans. That's our therapy for people with cancer. And we don't know how to get them to take it out to the curb. We don't know how to give them more bags to garbage it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know how to stop them from getting more garbage that they need to put in more bags in the first place. Because we say we don't believe in that. And we say we don't want to accuse the patient of creating their own problem, because we're compassionate. So don't worry, you didn't do anything. It's just bad luck and genes, and so we'll take your garbage out and we're good.
Right.
It's a very patronizing, materialistic, infantilizing way to see the world. You are a poor, misunderstanding, ignorant fool who can't do anything. You have no power. You have no say. You have no sovereignty. Mm-hmm. You just have to do what we say, and then maybe you'll be fine or maybe not, because sometimes it's incurable.
Right.
I mean, that is such a disempowering, it's like how we live today. You have no say. You can't go here. You can't go there. You can't look at anybody. We tell you who to touch and who not to touch. We tell you what to watch and what not to see. And you can't say because you don't know anything. And I don't want to live like that.
What about things like AZT, and then even these antivirals like remdesivir they're all connected to chemotherapy drugs too, right? I keep reading that these are like Daisy T, they dusted that off the shelf. It was a chemotherapy drug, and now they're going to use it as an antiviral, and remdesivir and these other things. I mean, how are those?
Yeah, they're chemo drugs because chemo essentially inhibits the DNA from breaking down.
Mhm.
And so if you stop the DNA from breaking down, it looks like you get less viruses.
Right.
And then sometimes that may, quote, stabilize the situation a little bit for the time being. Just like if you have a bunch of garbage cans and you remove the garbage cans with surgery, temporarily your house is a little cleaner. But, ultimately, the mortality rate doesn't change. And in fact, it kills a lot of people, both of those drugs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's crazy. Even the Johns Hopkins study that shows that allopathic medicine is like the third largest cause of death in the country, and people are still begging for it. Like they don't they
Right.
don't doubt the methodology. When I think you're spot on with this, like this martial warlike mythology is the problem, when we need to be looking at things in a much more holistic manner, and teaching people how to live healthier lives and how to eat better. I mean, you have a whole chapter in the book about food, what to eat, the kind of water to drink. I mean, clean water, for the billions of dollars that we're spending on vaccines around the world, or any of these other uh, drugs, a fraction of that cost could go towards giving people better drinking water.
Right. How about clean food, clean soil, clean air, clean water,
Right.
healthy relations,
Yeah.
simple life, fresh air, sunshine. Right. I mean,
There's a
but
good idea.
yeah. And now instead of all that, it's just this virus. And
Right.
it's just a spell. And that's why I finished the book with the a story about how this is not the first time human beings have been under a spell.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we better wake up soon because it doesn't look so good right now.
It is interesting how powerful it is psychologically on people. They're just so they're so insistent that this methodology, even though it clearly hasn't been working, like they're hitting their head against the wall. More chemo drugs, right? More chemo drugs, and then it'll all go away. Well, you've been doing this for 75 years or more, and it's not helping. So when can they wake up from the spell? Like, what does it take?
I don't know. We'll see.
It's crazy.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, are you ready to call it? I could talk for another half an hour. I usually give my subscribers a little something extra. So, I mean, it's up to you. We could call it now,
Yeah,
but
I think we're good.
all right. Yeah, an hour is pretty solid. We got a lot of good
Yeah.
information out to everybody. I would recommend reading the book. I did want to get into this idea of resonance. I mean, there's so much more that we could talk about, this idea of resonance, and then the fourth phase of water that you get into, and how the body works as a crystalline structure. And this is part of the communication device that you're talking about when we talk about how exosomes and genetic material can get communicated from person to person in this alternative theory, to just this viral contagion theory that we're so used to. But people are going to have to read the book. So,
Yeah.
and
Good.
they're going to have to get it on Barnes and Noble because it's not on Amazon.
Yeah. Barnes and Noble or drtomcowan.com. We have some copies there.
Okay, sounds great. I'll point people in that direction.
Great.
All right. Thanks again for being on the show. Why don't you can you
Okay.
tell people where to get in touch with the Weston Price Foundation as well, so they know, because I know you're deeply involved with
Yeah,
those
just
guys.
westonaprice.org.
Okay. All right. Sounds great.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Thanks for your time, Dr. Cowan. You have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, that was another fantastic episode of The Shift. Really happy to have that conversation with Dr. Tom Cowan. What a great guy! I mean, he's managing to put forth this terrain theory, not quite terrain, but not viral theory of disease spread, and he's sticking to his guns. And I got to say, this contagion myth really lays it out. and I'd recommend checking it out for any of you who are open-minded enough to be able to look at some of this information that's alternative to what the medical establishment considers to be the case in terms of how diseases are spread. One of the things, I think I've said this a couple of times, but one of the good things that's come out of the whole coronavirus fiasco that we're all living through right now is that on a certain corner of the web, this whole terrain theory versus virus theory debate kind of exploded out of nowhere. People like Dr. Andy Kaufman, Dr. Cowan, of course, Dr. Stephanie Seneff, and Dr. Judy Mikovits have been discussing these alternative theories, and the interesting thing is it's really starting to make sense to me. I mean, initially I was kind of blown away, and I was thinking this is a little bit too far out for me. I'm not sure if I can give this perspective credence, but I can tell you that after reading the Contagion myth, it's pretty well laid out. He's got the scientific sources to back up his point of view. And at least it makes you gotta wonder enough to do your own research and decide for yourself what you believe. It just kind of goes back to that central theme that we've been bumping up against over and over again, which is healthcare freedom. So sad that the pharmaceutical companies and the government corporate complex just doesn't allow medical doctors like Dr. Cowan or a Dr. Robert Young, who wrote the pH Miracle, who I've spoken to in a roundtable discussion. They just don't let these doctors have the time of day. They don't get to participate in the mainstream conversations, and so a really healthy debate around these issues never really happens. And it's up to us as individuals to decide what kind of healthcare we would like and we would choose, whether it be the allopathic model or a more holistic approach. It seems to me like it should be a personal choice. So, really want to put it out there for people like Dr. Cowan who are getting this alternative information out and explaining an alternative point of view for everybody so you can make those decisions. One of the things that he brought up that really kind of blew my mind was this idea that the viral theory, which is now probably 200 years old, was discovered or was theorized well before even the discovery of bacteria and viruses. And now, it wasn't until the 1980s until scientists discovered that human beings have a birome and a virome, and that these things are inside of us and they're serving some function. Obviously, we're not disease-ridden all the time, so the virome must be there for a reason. And it's just fascinating that, the virus theory wasn't able to evolve when the new information came along. So, I mean, I think this is part of the work that Dr. Cowan and others are doing, is to take that new information and start to question the earlier theories when science has evolved to a place that takes it beyond the initial model. So really, I think worth looking into. I highly recommend the book, The Contagion Myth. You can find out. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention real quick before we get out there, before I let you go, is that his medical theory is starting to sound a lot more like wisdom teachings from all over the world, and this is something that I also promote on this program, especially because I think there is a lot of wisdom in the sciences of other cultures. It wasn't like white guys just showed up and discovered reason and figured out a worldview that was, superior to everybody else's. It's like, guess what? Other cultures have been thinking about things for a long time, and they think about things differently than, Western culture has come to this point. But there's a lot of good to the systems that you can learn about should you choose to listen to their mythologies and understand their alchemies. And Dr. Cowan's really knocking on the door, taking Western science and then cross-pollinating, or at least taking the language of Western scientists and, in a sense, rediscovering what these wisdom traditions have known all along. So I think it brings a lot of credence to people who are presenting a Western medical argument for paying closer attention maybe to the Ayurvedic medicines or the traditional Chinese medicines or the indigenous medicines, medical systems that people have been using for tens of thousands of years in some cases, because there's actually something to them. And so it's refreshing for me to see Dr. Cowan doing this work to show how science is actually showing how, human beings, there is a unified field. Human beings do work on these energy frequencies, um, and that the energy inside of our bodies needs to be healthy in order for our bodies to be healthy. So again, just happy to have this conversation with him. I really am glad that he came on the show. I've been trying to put this together really since last June, and he was moving around a lot. So we finally got to have the chat. I would highly recommend checking things out. All of his books, actually. I've read 2 of them so far. But you can go to drtomcowan.com and you can see all of his work there. Plus, I recommend checking out the Weston A. Price Foundation, westonaprice.org, where Dr. Cowan works with a lot of other individuals to kind of promote a health and wellness philosophy that you can get more information about there. So I'll just take a second to remind everybody that you've been listening to The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKenty. You can check out The Shift with Doug McKenty on Facebook and on YouTube, and I'm also on Twitter at @DMcKenty, or of course the website www.theshiftnow.com, where you can check out all of the roundtable discussions that I've been doing with Rob Rubin at Transparent Media Truth, as well as all the Shift episodes and an old show that I did on local radio. So there's a lot of content there if you want to check that out. Just another reminder to please like and share and subscribe. We're really counting on our listeners to help with distribution here. So if you like what you're hearing, go ahead and click on share and get it out to all of your friends, because you are going to be the primary drivers of this information, I think, given the current state of things on the internet. So if you'll make that effort, you'll go a long way towards helping make the shift possible. So thanks again for listening, and I'll be back next week with another episode. So take care until then, and we'll see you then. Bye.